When you picture the 1950s, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's a time seen through a golden-hued lens. It's poodle skirts and sock hops, brand new TVs in every living room, and gleaming cars cruising down Main Street. It's the picture of post-war optimism and era of supposed simplicity and safety, where communities were tight-knit and nobody bothered to lock their doors. But that image, that idea of a perfect, innocent America, it's a carefully curated one. Because behind the smiling faces and white picket fences, a much darker reality was taking hold. A wave of brutal, baffling crimes began to rip through the country, exposing the fragile illusion of safety and leaving a permanent scar on the nation's psyche. This is the story of the 1950s you haven't seen. This is the story of the murders that shattered an era. Our story begins not in a dark city alley, but on a sunlit street in Berkeley, California. In the spring of 1955, this was a town of academics and families, a picture of suburban calm. On April 28th, 14-year-old Stephanie Bryan, a bright student at Willard Junior High, was taking her usual shortcut home from school. She never made it. When she didn't arrive, her parents began to worry, and soon, one of the largest missing persons searches in Berkeley's history was underway. For months, there was nothing but terrifying silence. The case captivated and horrified the Bay Area. A schoolgirl vanishing in broad daylight struck at the heart of the suburban dream. The first break came in July, when a woman named Georgia Abbott made a strange discovery in the basement of the Alameda home she shared with her husband, Burton, a purse containing Stephanie Bryan's ID card. A more thorough police search of the basement unearthed more of the girl's belongings, including her glasses and a brassiere. The man of the house, Burton Abbott, was a 27-year-old UC Berkeley accounting student and a married father. He seemed an unlikely suspect, but the discoveries in his home, which he couldn't explain, put him at the center of the investigation. Then came the final, devastating discovery. 2 weeks later, investigators found Stephanie's body in a shallow grave nearly 300 miles away, just a few hundred feet from the Abbott family's remote mountain cabin. She had been bludgeoned to death. The trial was a national sensation. The prosecution, despite having only circumstantial evidence, painted Abbott as a sexual psychopath who had kidnapped and murdered the girl. Abbott, who appeared cocky and detached throughout the trial, maintained it was all a monstrous frame. He was found guilty and, in March 1957, executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin, proclaiming his innocence to the end. The case, built on circumstantial evidence and fueled by media frenzy, was a chilling lesson for parents everywhere. It suggested that the monster to be feared wasn't a shadowy figure, but could be the educated family man next door, shattering the illusion of safety in their own quiet neighborhoods. Our next story takes place in Chicago. In the winter of 1956, the city was buzzing with post-war energy, and the whole world was falling in love with a singer from Tupelo, Mississippi, named Elvis Presley. For two sisters from the working-class McKinley Park neighborhood, 15-year-old Barbara and 12-year-old Patricia Grimes, Elvis was everything. They were obsessed. They'd already seen his new movie, Love Me Tender, more than 10 times. So, on the night of December 28th, with just over $1 between them, they begged their mother Loretta to let them go see it one more time at the Brighton Theater. It was a cold night, but the trip was only about a mile. They were supposed to be home by midnight, but midnight came and went. Then, 1 a.m., then 2, Loretta, a divorced mother of 6, started to panic. She sent her older kids to check the bus stops, but there was no sign of Barbara and Patricia. By the next morning, a mother's worry had turned into a full-blown crisis. She reported her daughters missing. What happened next was one of the biggest missing persons investigations in Chicago's history. The whole city got involved. 2 young girls just vanishing on their way home from the movies. It struck at the very heart of the era's sense of safety. Police canvassed neighborhoods, and thousands of flyers with the girls' smiling faces were plastered everywhere. Their story was front-page news. Tips flooded in, creating a timeline that made no sense. One report said they were with 2 young men, looking disheveled. People claimed to have seen the girls all over town at diners, on buses, even at a hotel in Nashville. These sightings fueled a theory that the police clung to, that Barbara and Patricia weren't victims, but runaways, chasing some fantasy of meeting Elvis from Graceland. Elvis himself even made a public plea, asking the girls to please call their mother and go home. But Loretta Grimes never bought it. She knew her daughters. They wouldn't just run off. As she'd later say, "I tried to tell police my daughters didn't run away, but they didn't listen to me. For weeks, the case was just a horrible cycle of hope and despair." Her worst fears were confirmed. On January 22, 1957, a construction worker named Leonard Prescott was driving down a lonely stretch of German church road in the suburb of Willow Springs when he saw something in a ditch. He thought it was two mannequins. As he got closer, he realized the horrifying truth. The naked bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes lay frozen in the snow. Their father was brought to the scene to identify them a parent's absolute worst nightmare. Realized on a desolate frozen roadside, the discovery sent a shockwave of terror through Chicago. The city's innocence was shattered. The question wasn't, where are they? It was, who could do this, and why? The autopsy just made things murky. The coroner first said the girls probably died from exposure to the cold just hours after they disappeared. But that completely contradicted all those witness sightings. There were strange marks on Barbara's body and bruises on their faces, but no clear cause of death. The public was completely captivated and horrified. It was a crime that changed how parents saw the world outside their front door. Suddenly, letting your kids go to the movies wasn't so simple anymore. If it could happen to the Grimes sisters, it could happen to anyone's kids. A monster had snatched two children from their ordinary lives, and the fact that police couldn't find him left a chilling fear that he could be anyone, anywhere. The investigation became a total circus. A 21-year-old drifter named Benny Bedwell was arrested. After a grueling interrogation, he signed a 14-page confession, saying he and a buddy partied with the girls for a week before dumping their bodies. It sounded like a breakthrough, but his story was full of holes. Bedwell later recanted, saying police forced him to confess, and the charges were dropped. Other suspects came and went, but nothing ever stuck. The case just got colder and colder. Between the conflicting reports, the confusing witness statements, and the lack of forensic technology, investigators hit a dead end. The murder of the Grimes sisters is still one of Chicago's most infamous cold cases. Just over a year later, in February 1957, another discovery sent a different kind of chill across the country. This time, the horror wasn't about who the victim was, but the fact that nobody seemed to know. In the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia, a college student was checking his muskrat traps when he stumbled on a cardboard box in the woods. Inside, wrapped in a plaid blanket, was the naked, bruised body of a little boy. He was thought to be between 3 and 7 years old. His hair had been recently and crudely chopped off, with clumps still clinging to his body. He was malnourished and covered in scars, some old, some new. The cause of death was multiple blows to the head. And yet someone had cleaned his body and carefully folded his arms over his stomach. Who was this child? Where did he come from? These questions kicked off one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. At first, police were optimistic. They had fingerprints, a description, and even the box he was found in a bassinet carton from a local J.C. Penney. The Philadelphia Inquirer printed 400,000 flyers with a sketch of the boy's face and stuck them in every gas bill in the city. He became known as the Boy in the Box, and later, America's Unknown Child. The investigation was massive. Detectives chased down thousands of leads, checking orphanages and foster homes. They looked into a nearby foster home after a psychic pointed them there, but hit a dead end. Another wild theory came from a woman who claimed her abusive mother had bought the boy, kept him in a basement, killed him in a fit of rage, and then made her help dump the body. Police found a similar bassinet in the house, but the woman had a history of mental illness. Years bled into decades. The case files got thicker, but the central question was never answered. Who was he? The case was a chilling example of the limits of mid-century forensics. Without DNA, a confession, or a solid witness, identifying a child who was never even reported missing was basically impossible. He was a ghost, a child who had seemingly fallen through the cracks, invisible in life and anonymous in death. He was buried in a potter's field, his grave marked America's Unknown Child. But he wasn't forgotten. A small group of investigators and citizens kept his case alive, exhuming his body twice. In 1998, and again in 2019, hoping that new science could finally give him a name. For 65 years, he remained a question mark. Then, in late 2022, the breakthrough finally came not from an old file, but from modern science. Using DNA from the 2019 exhumation, forensic genealogists built a family tree. They found a relative on his mother's side, which led them to a birth certificate for a child no one knew she'd had. On December 8, 2022, Philadelphia police announced that America's unknown child was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Born January 13, 1953, he was just 4 years old when he was murdered. While his parents were both deceased, the investigation into who killed him is still very active. Giving Joseph his name back was a huge deal, a promise kept after more than 6 decades. But it also changes how we see the case. He's no longer a symbol. He's a real little boy with a name and a story who suffered unimaginable horrors. His case was terrifying because it suggested a child could just be erased, their life unknown and their death unmourned. For 65 years, he represented a failure of the system. Today, Joseph Augustus Zarelli represents the incredible persistence of those who refuse to let him be forgotten. The year 1959 was when things really came to a head. 2 crimes just weeks apart would cement a new and terrifying reality in the American mind. They proved that the darkness wasn't just in the big cities anymore. It could find its way to the quietest, most idyllic places you could imagine. This brings us to the heartland, to Holcomb, Kansas, a small farming town where everybody knew everybody. Crime was something that happened in other places. At the center of this community was the Clutter family. Herbert Clutter, 48, was a successful farmer and a respected man. He and his wife Bonnie had 2 teenagers still at home, 16-year-old Nancy, the town sweetheart, and 15-year-old Kenyon, a quiet kid who loved to tinker. They were, by all accounts, the picture of wholesome rural American life. That picture was shattered on the morning of November 15, 1959. A neighbor, worried when the Clutters didn't answer their phone, went to check on them. The house was silent. Inside was a scene of unbelievable horror. All 4 members of the family, Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon, had been bound, their mouths taped shut and killed with shotgun blasts to the head. The motive seemed to be robbery, but the killers got away with less than $50, a pair of binoculars, and a radio. The story they'd been chasing about, a safe filled with $10,000 in cash, was completely made up. The town of Holcomb was plunged into shock and fear. For the first time, people started locking their doors. The Clutter murders signaled a horrifying new kind of crime, a senseless, violent attack on the family home by total strangers for almost nothing. It meant that no one, no matter how good or how isolated, was truly safe. The investigation was intense. There were few clues, but the big break came from an inmate at the Kansas State Penitentiary. He had once worked for Herb Clutter and had told his cellmate, a con man named Richard Dick Hickok, the bogus story about the safe full of cash. Hickok had just been paroled. He teamed up with another ex-con, Perry Smith, a drifter with a violent temper. On the night of November 14th, they drove to Holcomb, fantasizing about the perfect score. They walked into the Clutter home through an unlocked door. When they found no safe, their frustration exploded into a rage that left 4 innocent people dead. 6 weeks later, on December 30th, 1959, Hickok and Smith were arrested in Las Vegas. During interrogation, their stories fell apart, and Smith gave a chillingly detailed confession. They were found guilty and sentenced to death, and were eventually executed in 1965. The Clutter murders might have just been a local tragedy, if not for the author Truman Capote. He read a small news brief about the crime and was fascinated by how senseless it was. He traveled to Kansas with his friend, author Harper Lee, and spent years interviewing everyone involved, investigators, townspeople, and the killers themselves. The result was his 1966 masterpiece, In Cold Blood. The book was a phenomenon. It wasn't just a crime report. It was a non-fiction novel that got inside the minds of the killers, while painting a heartbreaking portrait of the victims. In Cold Blood brought the horror of what happened in Holcomb into living rooms across America. It helped shape our entire understanding of true crime, exploring the terrifying idea that evil could just erupt for no reason and destroy the innocent. The book marked a cultural turning point, cementing the idea that the 50s sense of safety was, in fact, a myth. Just 34 days after the Clutter family was murdered, the nightmare seemed to repeat itself, this time in Florida. The similarities were so chilling, they felt like they had to be connected. On December 19, 1959, in the small town of Osprey, another family was destroyed in their home. Cliff Walker, 25, his wife Christine, 24, and their two small children. 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie were found murdered. Christmas presents lay unopened under the tree. The scene was devastating. Christine had been assaulted and shot. Cliff had been shot, little Jimmy was shot, and baby Debbie was shot and then drowned in the bathtub. The community was horrified, and investigators immediately saw the parallels to the Clutter case, a family of 4 killed in their rural home for no clear reason. Suspicion quickly fell on Perry Smith and Dick Hickok. After the Kansas murders, the two had fled south and were known to have been in Florida around that time. In fact, they'd been spotted in Sarasota, just miles from the crime scene. One of the strongest leads was that the Walkers had been looking to buy in 1986. Chevy Bel Air, exact same model car, Smith and Hickok were driving. When they were arrested for the Clutter case, they were questioned about the Walker murders. They denied everything and reportedly passed a polygraph test, though those were notoriously unreliable. They had an alibi that seemed to check out, so law enforcement focused on the Kansas crime. For decades, the Walker case remained a separate and very cold mystery. The investigation in Florida went nowhere. A serial killer even confessed, but it turned out to be a lie he'd pieced together from newspaper reports. The trail went cold, leaving one of Florida's oldest and most disturbing cases unsolved. But the theory about Smith and Hickok never completely went away. In 2012, decades later, Sarasota County detectives decided to give it another look. They took the extraordinary step of exhuming the bodies of Smith and Hickok to get DNA samples, hoping to compare them to evidence from the Walker crime scene. But the results were inconclusive. After all those years, the samples were just too degraded. In a frustrating twist, it turned out they didn't even have a clean DNA profile from the Walkers to make a good comparison. The effort to solve one mystery only highlighted the limitations of another era's evidence collection. To this day, the Walker family murders are officially unsolved. We may never know if they were the final victims of Smith and Hickok, or if another monster was loose in Florida. But the case serves as a terrifying echo. It hammered home the lesson of the Clutter murders. The family home was no longer a safe haven. The year 1959 ended with a nation on edge. Realizing that this kind of violence wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern, weaving its way through the American landscape from the fields of Kansas to the shores of Florida. Stephanie Bryan, the Grimes sisters, Joseph Zarelli, the Clutters, the Walkers, these weren't just isolated incidents. They were headlines in a decade-long story of fear that was tearing down the post-war illusion of safety. The 1950s were filled with crimes that, famous or not, all added to this growing feeling of unease. What all these cases show us is a critical turning point. Forensic science in the 1950s was so limited, investigators had fingerprints and ballistics, but without DNA, they often hit a wall. Many cases relied on confessions, which, as we saw with the Grimes sisters, could be unreliable or even forced. The era's investigative tools were just no match for this new wave of brutal, random crime. Thanks to intense media coverage, these local tragedies became national nightmares. The idea of the senseless killing entered the vocabulary. Before, murders were usually about passion or greed between people who knew each other. But the Clutter, Walker, and bouncing ball cases introduced a new kind of predator. The killer who strikes without motive, who chooses victims at random, and who violates our safest spaces for reasons no one can understand. This was the true underbelly of the 1950s. It wasn't about the mob. It was about the slow erosion of the belief that you were safe in your home, that your kids were safe at the movies, and that your community could protect you from the darkness. By the end of the decade, that sense of security was shattered. The image of the 1950s as a golden age of innocence is powerful. It's an idea we all want to believe, in a simpler, safer time. But the stories of Stephanie Bryan, Barbara and Patricia Grimes, of Joseph Augustus Zarelli, of the Clutter and Walker families, they tell a different, darker truth. They remind us that no decade is safe from the worst of human nature. These crimes weren't just tragedies. They were cultural shocks that changed the American psyche forever. They revealed just how vulnerable people were beneath the polished surface of suburban life. They've forced a generation to face the fact that evil wasn't something that only happened somewhere else to other people. It could show up on your doorstep, in a quiet town, on a familiar road, without any warning or reason. The legacy of these crimes is the world we live in now, a world of locked doors and a lost sense of trust. The shattering of 1950s innocence wasn't a single event, but a slow, painful process marked by the headstones of the innocent. Their stories are a somber reminder that the past is never as simple as we remember it, and that the peace of any era is always more fragile than it seems. The stories of this era are complex, and new truths are still being uncovered. If you want to keep exploring the hidden histories and forgotten crimes that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell, and let us know your thoughts on these cases in the comments below. What other events from this era do you think changed how we see the world? Join the conversation, and we'll see you next time.